I have a kind of a collection of state capitals I've already visited, and the one in Olympia is number 47 on my bucket list. So, and I kind of enjoy that this afternoon. Yeah, thanks so much for the invitation, for having me, and I hope you will enjoy the talk. I will focus my lecture specifically on the Czech Republic, or Czechia, the country I come from, because as you can see on the map, thanks to its strategic position right in the very heart of Europe, it has always been a meeting point, a center of business and culture, and the place where the West met the East. Thus, we can also see it as a small laboratory, where the latest trends and the mood of the population copy what is happening in the European continent or the European Union in general. If we use the language of computer game players, the Czech Republic is like a demo version of a real game being played beyond its borders. Before the pandemic, my country had one of the lowest unemployment rates in Europe. Its economy was growing, the quality of life was very high, but still, we Czechs were labeled troublemakers and an inner opposition in the European Union because of our lukewarm approach toward further integration of the European Union and cooperation with our partners on various issues. A general tension within the EU, which has lasted for some years now, has also led to the rise of populism, one of the very serious threats to liberal democracy and democratic development in Europe. So I would like to talk about it more in detail because with the ongoing war in Ukraine, populism is a burning topic on a daily basis. So, the Czech Republic, or officially called Czechia, both names were approved by the United Nations, is a small country in Central Europe with 10.5 million people, with its economy strongly tied to the larger German economy, and with most of its foreign trade with other member countries of the European Union. We have been a stable member of the EU since 2004, and there is no real alternative for us than a deepening integration into the Union. However, something we call Euroscepticism has dramatically increased in the past few years. What does it actually mean? Euroscepticism entered the political discourse in, let's say, late 1990s, but initially it was exclusively used as an expression which focused on all kinds of opposition, criticism, and negative attitudes towards the European Union and the progress of the European integration. In many cases, Euroscepticism was just subjective and vague in meaning, lacking any proper framework, and it attracted primarily less educated and less politically knowledgeable individuals. But this has changed in recent years. Public opinion about the European Union is now playing a major role. We usually distinguish hard and soft Euroscepticism. Hard Euroscepticism refers to a complete rejection of EU membership, usually hand in hand with the rejection of NATO. Whereas soft Eurosceptics support just the limited EU membership, but they are very critical of various aspects of integration, such as the cross-border movement of people, the adoption of the common currency euro, or giving up powers and responsibilities of the local, state government, in favor of a supranational leadership in Brussels, meaning the European Parliament, the European Commission, and other European institutions. The current situation in the Czech Republic in many ways reflects the past. While they are not under direct rule of another power, many Czechs feel dominated by larger EU nations. That is especially true of Germany, as the Czechs already have negative historical associations with Germanic people who now dominate the EU decision-making. Let me remind you that the Czech lands were under the direct German/Austrian rule for more than 300 years, and many Czechs see their national identity as having been defined from the outside. And criticisms of the EU bring up this historical threat to our national sovereignty, the three historical periods in which the Czech lands were under the rule of a foreign power, and the Czechs, as a nation, had to make concessions to survive. I'm speaking of three historical periods. That's the very long period under the Habsburg dynasty, when the Czech lands were part of the Austrian Empire, from 1620s until the end of World War I, when the Czechoslovak Republic was established. Then it's the Nazi occupation during the World War II, and finally the Soviet supremacy between 1948 and 1989, while after August 1968 it was a direct military occupation. So this is reflected in many ways, or in many criticisms of the EU that depict the Czech Republic as a pawn controlled by the West. Thus, the EU encroachment on domestic issues is seen by many people as a clear evidence of a foreign rule. There is a feeling of lost sovereignty as a result of EU membership, but by its very definition, membership of the EU means that any member state will simply have to give up certain aspects of self-governance in order to fully participate in the European project. So Eurosceptics are able to tap into these nationalistic sentiments in order to gain support for their cause, whether or not the loss of sovereignty is real or just imagined. And there are many factors that may influence the growth of Euroscepticism and populism, but one of the most significant ones is the expansion of the EU's authority into domestic matters. Critics have said that there is a democratic deficit in the governing of the EU, that the decision-making processes in Brussels are simply too distant, too strange, too complicated, that the EU leaders are not responsible for their decisions to the Czech voters and public. It's the EU bureaucracy, inefficiency, disrespect towards opinions, feelings and needs of the people in the member states, and also the fact that the European law in many cases overrides the Czech constitution and the Czech laws. All of that has been criticized by all parties across the Czech political scene for the past 19 years of our membership. But recently there have been a few issues that made Euroscepticism mainstream and a serious burning topic on a daily basis. First of all, it was Brexit in 2016. Brexit was also a clear warning to the EU elites that the Union needed immediate reforms. I believe that the Czech Republic should be in the middle of these changes for the better, the building of the new EU vision, because it's a win-win solution for everyone. We can show that we are creative, respectful of our partners, and not merely the ones who criticize constantly, who don't care, who sit in the back, let the others do the work and shout only when we don't like something. Some critics of the European Union among Czech politicians even called for a similar referendum, preferably leading to a Czechs, but it's highly unlikely. Because, as I said, there is no real alternative for us than deepening integration. And the Czechs benefit greatly from the European single market and EU structural and investment funds. We were able to draw billions, tens of billions of euros from these arrangements in the past 19 years of our membership, so that we could build highways and roads, protect the environment, renovate cities, modernize industry, allow our students to get university degrees from prestigious Western European universities, etc., etc. And yet, more and more people are more and more people are calling for Czechs. Why? I think that we have to look at this trend from a broader perspective, and we see that the rejection of the European Union and common European values is again closely tied to populism. Political parties lacking any ideological foundation and using populist appeals emerged in Central and Eastern Europe in general at the end of 1990s. These parties did not adopt radical ideology until 2010, 2011, speaking of the Czech Republic, populism was not a prominent element of our politics. Meaning mostly political parties at the periphery of the political spectrum used some kind of populist rhetoric. Also compared to other countries in the region, the Czech Republic had one of the most stable and relatively closed party systems. And it was characterized by almost exclusive unidimensional competition, meaning there was one major party on the right, it was the Civic Democratic Party, and there was one major leftist party, that was the Social Democrats. Let me also remind you that our political system is a bit different from the one in the United States. We have a parliamentary democracy. Our parliament consists of two chambers, the House and the Senate. It's the Prime Minister who is head of the government, and we also have the President who is the head of the state. And yeah. But then, as I said, in 2010, 2011, the new generation of voters grew up, and these seem to be characterized by a lower level of identification with traditional left-wing, centrist, right-wing political parties, and they show the tendency to be attracted instead by simplified populist promises, and therefore to be linked with the new protest, or we call them anti-establishment parties and movements. These political entities usually divide society into two antagonist groups: the pure people, like the good ones, versus the corrupt elites. They argue that politics should be an expression of the general will of the people. They emphasize real or just imaginary threat or crisis. They claim to speak for the good and honest people, and they attack the out-of-touch elites. You certainly remember that your former president often used the claim joining the swamp in DC during his campaign in 2016. And we have it pretty much in our country, pretty much the same thing. Furthermore, it is often problematic to identify the parties and movements on the left-right political spectrum, because very often they combine elements from both ends of the spectrum, plus they're using populist language. There is also an important role of charismatic leaders and rhetorical features such as tabloid style, dramatization, and use of social media to spread fake news and disinformation. But if you look at this trend, populism, from the European perspective, we see that populists have established themselves as a powerful political force and have become even integral members of coalition governments in many countries. Italy, Denmark. You've probably heard about the party called the Alternative for Germany, whose influence and power was exponentially growing as a reaction of the politics of former Chancellor Angela Merkel, who led Germany between 2005 and 2021. So we can say this is kind of a European trend in general. In the Czech Republic, we also have our small Trump, billionaire Andrej Babiš, who is the fifth wealthiest man in the country. He's also a man surrounded by multiple corruption scandals. And Mr. Babiš is actually a very interesting case. The red cap inspiration is obvious. It says Stromčeky. He was born in Slovakia. In 1990s, he founded a conglomerate called Agrofert that operates in the fields such as agriculture, logistics, energy, chemical industry, forestry. Today, more than 230 companies are covered by the umbrella trademark Agrofert, worth of more than $4 billion. Kind of a nice family company, right? So Andrej Babiš decided to enter politics in 2011, claiming the traditional Czech political parties did not do a good job in ruling the country. So he founded a new party, or better to say, movement, called ANO. ANO in Czech means yes, but it's also the abbreviation of the actions of dissatisfied citizens. He mainly criticized the corruption affairs that were, in his opinion, much more frequent and worse than in the neighboring countries. And after he stepped into the political arena, many political scientists used the term Berlusconization of politics, named after Italian Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi, who also established his own party. He owned the biggest media in the country, in Italy, and basically dominated public space. So Babiš in the Czech Republic followed his steps. He bought the two largest daily periodicals, he bought a radio station, he bought a TV channel, and has been using them very effectively to influence the public opinion. Before the parliamentary election in 2017, his marketing team prepared a very smart face-to-face campaign in the streets. And sometimes it really looked like that Babiš was everywhere. He handed out donuts at the subway station in Prague. He was visiting regions with mobile booths with fried chicken. He was meeting people and presented promises of higher wages, higher pensions, and basically benefits for various groups of the population. We have to admit that he devoted an incredible amount of time, money, and energy to the campaign. And it was worth to him because our movement won the election in 2017, and he became our prime minister for 4 years. ANO was fortunately defeated in the following parliamentary election in October 2021, so Babiš was ousted from power, but he still keeps a very strong supporter base, and ANO party is the strongest opposition party in the parliament, and also Andrej Babiš himself ran for president 2 months ago. He made it to the second round, where he was fortunately beaten by Petr Pavel. He became our new president. He took the office just months ago, on March 9th. He's a retired general of the Czech army, and known abroad mostly for his long career in NATO, where he also chaired its military committee. But during this long presidential campaign, the war in Ukraine and other topics belong to the most frequently discussed topics, and that brings us actually back to populism, because it was Andrej Babiš who brought new unflattering dimension of populist rhetoric into the Czech politics and public space. He obviously wanted to use the war for his own purpose, because he sensed correctly that it stirred up emotions and fears in the population. I will talk about Ukraine a bit later, but let's get back now to the criticisms of the European Union. The Czech Republic, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, 4 countries in Central Europe, maintain closer relations than they do with the rest of the European Union through a local alliance called Visegrad Group, or just B4. In recent years, each one of them has had to deal with increasing populism, again more or less connected with negativism, focused either on corruption, the heritage of communism, and dissatisfaction with developments after its fall in 1989 and the transition to democracy. You probably heard about Viktor Orbán, right, the Prime Minister of Hungary since 2010, who is kind of trying to build a semi-autocratic regime. He's suppressing independent judiciary, independent media. The same is happening in Poland to some extent under the rule of the party Law and Justice. The Slovaks are going to have parliamentary election very soon, and there's a chance that Robert Fico, former prime minister, will come back to power, and he's also a very pro-Russian politician, and we can call him populist. And again, in all these countries, the EU factor plays an important role. It's the national interests versus the directives coming from Brussels. And let me emphasize that the people in the countries that belong to the Soviet bloc during the Cold War are actually very sensitive about any pressure from outside. I have already talked about the feeling of a German dominance that many Czechs share, but there is another similar comparison. As you know, for more than 4 decades following the end of World War II, the communist regimes in Central and Eastern Europe, including the one in Czechoslovakia, received strategic decisions from Moscow alone. Official propaganda talked about the Soviets as liberators, protectors, greatest friends, equal partners, but in fact, the countries behind the Iron Curtain were nothing more than satellites and subordinated vassals of the Soviet Union. We call these regimes people's democracies, but in fact, they were far from any participation or involvement of their citizens in decision making. In the late 1980s, the rulers were completely distant from their dominated citizens, and the communist regimes were just, rotten castles falling apart day by day. And so the current situation, the current relations, and we can call it abyss of misunderstanding between Brussels, meaning the European leaders, and even the old countries, the old members of the European Union, in Western Europe, and the new countries, the new members in the East, remind sometimes the old times before the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989. The analysts and sociologists warn that there is a widespread mood in the society, that the old values and guarantees are gone, that the government is more of an obstacle to achieving prosperity than a facilitator, that the mainstream media are not telling the truth, and therefore it's necessary to look for alternative sources of information. Simply put, there is some dark conspiracy, some deep state behind all of us, and populist parties, movements, and politicians are naturally trying to take advantage of it in order to gain political support. This narrative of omnipresent conspiracy and threat was to be seen also during the so-called European refugee crisis. This is the term given to a period beginning in March, April 2015, when rising numbers of people arrived in the European Union, traveling across the Mediterranean Sea or overland through southern Europe, through Balkan countries. Most of them came from Central Africa, from Southeast Asia, and of course also from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and other countries hit by an armed conflict or civil war. Speaking of the Czech Republic, vast majority of the people would have preferred to remain completely untouched by the influx of non-European foreigners, and some politicians, including Andrej Babiš, who was a member of the government since 2014. He was a Minister of Finance, and then, as I said, after 2017, he became our Prime Minister. So he immediately understood that the fears and concerns of the population could bring him, political profit easily, and he even began to emphasize issues such as the spread of infectious diseases, terrorism, and formation of ghettos and isolated Muslim communities as a consequence of accepting refugees. And he also claimed that he was the only one who could protect the people, our way of life, national interests, European civilization, despite some nefarious interests of dark forces in Brussels. Another, I would call it, shining moment of populism was the coronavirus crisis, of course. Various conspirational theories about COVID-19 and its origins, about the real impact of the vaccine on people's health, changing of DNA, etc., found, unfortunately, enough listeners among frustrated citizens who blamed the government for the economic difficulties and impoverishment they were facing because of the quarantine and restrictions. This situation in the Czech Republic and in the European Union was pretty much the same as in the United States. We were under complete lockdown for more than 6 months. Kids didn't go to school for almost 10 months. We had to wear face masks in public. And of course, no one was happy about that, meaning additional points for the populists. And we barely had time to recover from the pandemic. And we had to face consequences, we had to face another crisis, we had to face consequences of the war in Ukraine. As we speak, the Czech Republic, out of the European countries, has taken the most Ukrainian refugees. According to the latest data, my country, which again has a population of 10.5 million, has granted temporary protection to 500,000 people from Ukraine, which is the equivalent to 5% of the entire population. Also, on March the 17th, so just 3 weeks ago, the Czech Republic signed into law a package of 3 government bills, collectively referred to in the media as Lex Ukraine, providing the war refugees with health insurance, access to the labor market with no restrictions, humanitarian allowance, social services, child care, etc., etc. And in exchange, I presume Czech companies expect they will be allowed to participate significantly in the restoration of Ukraine when the war is over. You know, the war from the beginning, 14 months ago, you know, it's a tragedy, it's a catastrophe. Fortunately, all 27 member states of the European Union have shown incredible unity and strength and have provided Ukraine with significant political, financial, and military support, and of course, humanitarian aid to refugees. In addition, the Union adopted a whole scale of sanctions against Russia and Belarus. And so far, the Union agreed on 10 sanction packages. These included the prohibition of transactions with the Russian banks, suspension of Russian broadcasting and propaganda channels in the European Union, prohibition of most imports from Russia, sanctions against companies and individuals linked with the Kremlin, and freezing or confiscation of their property, and even more restrictive rules for Russian citizens when applying for visas. Now it's more expensive, it takes longer time, it's much more complicated. The Czech Republic belongs to the hardliners in the EU and says very clearly that Russia is the aggressor and must pay. It needs some courage to act like that because the Czech economy always heavily relied on energy imports, and before the war, virtually all its gas originated in Russia. This left the country scrambling for alternative suppliers, and remarkably, at the end of last year, 2022, we had reduced the Russian gas dependency from 97% to 4% only. Wow. So, pretty good job, right? We were able to replace it with liquefied natural gas from Norway, Qatar, or even the United States. It is distributed to the Czech Republic and other countries through a special terminal in the Netherlands. So that went well, but still, half of Czech gas oil comes from Russia, and we still need to find a new supplier of raw materials for two nuclear power plants. Actually, no, because like 3 days ago, we signed a treaty with Westinghouse company, so that's taken care of. Good. So our energy dependence on supplies from Russia is obvious, and it needs to be seen as a security threat as well. Because as you know, the Kremlin doesn't hesitate to use gas and oil as a political weapon and as an instrument of pressure. Now let me make a short break and share my personal experience from Ukraine. I had a chance to visit the country many times. My grandfather was born in Ukraine in the region called Zakarpattia, which is now part of Ukraine, but in the interwar period it belonged to Czechoslovakia. And I also take part in the election observation missions from time to time, organized by the OSCE. Coming twice to Ukraine, actually only a few months after the Euromaidan revolution in 2014. I came for the presidential election in May 2014, and then for the parliamentary election in late October 2014. I had a chance to observe the election in the capital, in Kiev. I spent some time also in Kharkiv, which is the second largest Ukrainian city in the east, just 20 miles from the Russian border. The same in Ivano-Frankivsk, which is in the west, and also in many rural polling stations, small villages in the mountains, remote areas. We can see one of the rural polling stations. On the top, it's the largest monument or statue of Vladimir Ilyich Lenin in Eastern Europe, made of granite and bronze. It was placed in the middle of Freedom Square in Kharkiv. That was just a few weeks after our visit, after the election. It was toppled and demolished. The other two photos on the top come from Kiev, from Maidan, actually, from the square. And you can still see the charred buildings, tents, barricades, and remains of the revolution, or the civil unrest. And below, it's me at 6 a.m. at the beginning of a very long shift during the day. Here, as you can see, I'm still full of energy and expectations, but not for long. Don't misunderstand me. I'm biased. I have very deep sympathies for Ukrainians. I have friends among them. We even studied Ukrainian language at the university for 2 or 3 years. However, I can understand that the country was in a very deep troubles even without any Russian interference. Meaning the level of corruption, the kind of Soviet mindset, backwardness. You left Kiev, the capital, and 10 miles from there, you were in a different world. Underdeveloped rural areas, 19th century-like villages without proper infrastructure, poverty, no light at the end of the tunnel for most of the people who simply didn't have the right connections and enough money to bribe the authorities. And the elections were a great example. On paper, everything looked perfect. There was a new election law based on EU recommendations, more procedures were followed, members of the election committees seemed to be very well prepared and competent. The voters were excited and the turnout was very high, 70–75%. But during the E-Day, we realized there was something fishy. We saw obvious intimidation of voters, some unnecessary bureaucratic obstacles, campaigning in front of the polling stations, sometimes even the secrecy of voting wasn't ensured. There was this trench row of police officers and military officials. And above all, there were these strange men in black leather jackets with 3 cell phones who were actually the ones in charge, the real bosses on site. They were receiving orders from someone else over the phone. They were giving orders how to proceed to the chairman of the election committees. And they were present at all polling stations during the day, and even later in the evening at the district election committee, where the most important part of the day took place, meaning the tabulation and counting of the results. To be fair, I met the very same times in Belarus, in Armenia, in Georgia, I mean the country of Georgia, although your state of Georgia might need some election information as well. You can always recognize them. Black leather jackets, 2 many rings, 3 cell phones, and usually white socks in golf shoes. So, let me emphasize, it wasn't the fault of regular Ukrainians. It was the fault of the system that we're living in. A system that looked nice, democratic, transparent, reading Western standards at first sight. However, in reality, it was fake. It was rotten inside. It was developed and deformed by the oligarchs and by the crooked politicians whose only concern was to keep power and to embezzle as much money as possible, not to help the people, not to contribute to the healthy progress of the country as a whole. So I felt very sorry about that, and my Ukrainian friends shared the same frustration. That was the situation back in 2014, and since then, of course, Ukraine undoubtedly made an incredible jump towards becoming a modern country with a strong civil society, with democratic institutions and control mechanisms. But too many issues still remain unresolved, and there are still too many elephants in the room. Above all, the Soviet legacy, corruption, and strong ties with Russia. And Ukraine was only halfway to being considered a real candidate of for the membership of the European Union and Western structures. Therefore, I believe that the ongoing war, although it's an unspeakable tragedy and catastrophe, might also become a unique opportunity for Ukraine to start over, to break free of the shackles of the past, to gain a new confidence. For example, in the Czech Republic for the past 30 years, the Ukrainians were mostly seen as a cheap labor force. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians were coming to my country every year as seasonal workers in agriculture, workers in factories, construction workers. Thanks to Ukrainian men, we have our highways, subway system in Prague, houses, shopping centers, Thanks to Ukrainian women, our corridors and offices are clean, our shirts are ironed, our gardens are well maintained, our packages are delivered. So it is my sincere hope that after this terrible war, we will also acknowledge and admire Ukrainians as heroes, as fighters, as defenders of freedom and democratic values. So in the past 13 months, the price of gas and other commodities doubled or even tripled in the Czech Republic, and of course that was another tempting chance for populists to show themselves, to organize public protests, to criticize. Just for you to have a better idea, now the situation is a bit better, but in the summer of last year, it was like $8 per gallon of regular gas. So it was much more expensive than in the United States. As mentioned earlier, among the countries of the European Union, the Czech Republic has become one of the most outspoken supporters of Ukraine. And the newly formed populist / anti-establishment movement, involving a very strange mixture of communists, socialists, as well as far-right radicals, began to spread the narrative stressing worsening macroeconomic conditions, especially high inflation. As we speak, the inflation rate in the Czech Republic is between 18 and 20%. And the populists say that we are going to suffer, we are going to freeze during the winter, we are going to lose money and living standards only due to our support of Ukraine. They present a very simplified solution. The war is just a minor regional conflict between Ukraine and Russia. We should not intervene. Weapon supplies will only more prolongation and extension of the conflict. And they say that the best solution would be to force Ukraine to give up part of its territory, thus satisfy Russia, which will withdraw its troops, the war will be over and everyone will be happy again. They say they are the only ones calling for peace, but in fact, if you examine closer their communication with the public and content of their appeals and messages, it's full of anti-EU, anti-American, anti-West, and xenophobic narratives, depicting Vladimir Putin and his regime as guardians of traditional traditional values and Christianity, defending them from Western decline and decadence. Not a single word about the war, about war crimes, about bomb cities, mass graves, kidnapping of children, and other atrocities committed by the Russian forces. So there is an obvious bias and prejudice. For now, fortunately, these, I call them false populist saviors, attract only a fragment of the population. According to the latest polls, the vast majority of citizens still support the continuation of financial, material, and humanitarian aid to Ukraine, between 70 and 75%. The longer it goes on, of course, the lower the support. But for now, and for the upcoming months, we can say that the Czech citizens and also the citizens of the European Union strongly stand behind Ukraine. Although the warmest wishes for all of us should be for a quick end to this insane war and not seeing the suffering of the Ukrainian people anymore. So thank you very much for your attention. If you want to spare my vocal cords, then feel free to email me your questions. Otherwise, I'm happy to answer your questions right now. Thank you.
No.
Okay. We would like to take questions, and what I'm going to do is come around the room and use the microphone so everybody can hear your question. So, Martin, thank you very much for that presentation. I do have a question to start out with, and that is, what is your sense of the strength of the populist movement, the parties that you were talking about, which can be left and right, sort of combined? What is the strength in your country of that combination?
First of all, let me emphasize that the terms like leftist, socialist, radical, extreme is a bit different meaning in Europe. what would be considered socialist and far left in here, it's completely fine and normal in Europe. So I will start with that. For now, we have like 2 populist parties in the parliament out of 7. The other movement I mentioned, and that is also another party called the Party of the Direct Democracy, and they are very anti-European, anti-American, xenophobic, racist, anti-immigrant, which is fun because its chairman, his name is Tomio Okamura, and he's half Czech, half Japanese. So the son of an immigrant is against the immigration to the Czech Republic. It doesn't even make sense. Anyway, this party has 22 seats out of 200, so they are not the strongest one, very powerful, but they still have some. You can hear their voice.
Very good, because when you think of the United States, we always look at the House's makeup and then the Senate, and we're looking at one chair between Democrats and Republicans. But as a parliamentary system, you have a bigger mix with 7 different parties. So thank you for that answer.
Even more, 5 years ago there were 9 parties in the parliament. For example, I'm sorry to say that, but I feel that you, as American voters, only have the choice between lesser and bigger evil. I mean, I can label myself liberal, pro-Western voter living in Prague, in the capital, in the biggest city. And in the past 15 years, I had a chance to cast my vote and to support 5 different parties. So I don't rely on one party only. I have kind of a freedom of choice, which you don't have.
But could we all figure that out? So I'm going to take questions from this side of the room. Any hands up? Any hands up? Okay, Tony, you have a question. Your question is, you want to use the mic?
Yes, thank you. Although I do have a loud voice, I will use the mic. One of the things that we've seen, first of all, thank you for a very excellent presentation. One of the things that we've seen here, as I'm sure you know, in the United States with the rise of populism, is the violence that goes along with it. The riot at the Capitol, the rise of anti-Semitism, the rise of anti-LGBTQ, and so forth. To what extent do you see that occurring? Well, first of all, in the Czech Republic, but more broadly throughout Europe. Is there a rising tide? Is there a risk of an even greater rising tide of actual violence occurring out of populism?
It is. Fortunately, it's a bit smaller because we are not allowed to carry guns, right? No public that actually save us. But yeah, we see pretty much the same consequences of the rise of power of these parties. There were some public demonstrations against the measures, the anti-pandemic measures, and against the lockdown. Because people are frustrated. If you lose your job and you need money and you can do anything, then of course they are frustrated.
Okay, next question. I think Pat Krafchik, you have your hand up. Yes. Tell us your connection with Martin also, please, because I forgot to.
And she's the one that brought him here. So, Pat, how do you know Martin?
Yes, well, the connection is probably a bit complicated, but it comes back really to a mutual friend that we have, a friend that we've known for a long time, a friend in New York who connected me with Martin when I had a question relating to Zakarpattia, where you say your grandfather was born. And I'm doing some work in that area. I have been for many years, but I'm writing a book, and Martin was able to provide me with a very interesting journal that was about the subject I'm interested in. So that's our connection, and I thought he would be an excellent person to bring in here. But my question, Martin, to you, and it kind of carries over from the idea of violence and so on, is the question of that we saw some years ago already, but I'm wondering what the status of it is now. And that question has to do with not just people feeling bitter or cynical or linking themselves strongly with populism, but actually something like skinheads, gangs, or guys who are shaving their heads and going out on the streets. That was a problem, I know, also in Slovakia as well. In fact, in many places in Europe, including Germany too. What about at that level? That's already not just populism, that's something much more. Can you address that?
So, the radicalism, we had, we had to deal with that in the 1990s when there were serious street fights, the skinheads against the gypsies or Romani people that were destroying the Jewish cemeteries and stuff like that. But I think that now this rage and this hatred moved to the online, into the online space, to social media. They are a bit afraid to show themselves in the streets, so they rather use this very extreme rhetorics online. And maybe it's even more dangerous, who knows? Because they can easily influence, the younger generations, the kids, who knows?
Sad but true. Are there any questions over on this side? Yes, ma'am. Here you go. Microphone is yours, and then another one.
Have to speak into mic.
Can you hear me, sir?
Yeah.
Can you tell me if there's a mechanism or a process? You mentioned that sometimes the constitution for Czechoslovakia can be kind of overruled by EU rules. And I'm interested in what is the process for which folks from Czechoslovakia, your leaders, can go to the EU and try to mitigate something like that. Because the constitution is precious to the people. So does that make sense?
Yeah. First of all, here's
So the question?
Yeah.
Do you want to repeat the question?
There is no more Czechoslovakia. We split it 30 years ago, so now there are two separate countries, the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, or Czechia and Slovakia. It's fine. Many American journalists still haven't noticed this fact, and they still call my country Czechoslovakia, which is still fine. I even heard Chechnya, which is a bit different country as well. So it's Czechia or the Czech Republic, but we simply agreed on that. We signed when we joined the European Union in 2004. We just agreed on that we will be sometimes, listening to what Brussels is saying. And besides now, we, meaning the Czech Republic and the Slovak Republic, we are both in the Schengen area, meaning there are no borders, there are no restrictions. If I decided I want to buy property in Slovakia, I can do it right away. There are mixed couples, the Slovak students can study at the Czech universities. So for my generation, I believe that for the generation of my kids, it will be more like we are Europeans. We don't label ourselves, we are Czechs, we are, let's keep our traditions, let's keep this national pride. I think we are all Europeans, and again, I really believe that this European project is a win-win solution for everyone, because thanks to the European Union, there was no war in Europe for the past, 8 decades.
Can I just go a little bit further with your question, and there's one more. However, what if the Czech Parliament decided they didn't like what was coming from Brussels? Was there any mechanism for that? They would just have to participate in the EU discussions and make their point known there.
I would like them to decisions made here on the state level against the ones made in Washington, D.C. on the federal level. So I think there are some mechanisms.
I kind of would like to think of it as the United States of Europe, although I don't want to, impose the concept of the
United idea for the future.
In the future, United States of Europe. Maybe, but I don't know if you like the United States or not. I'm going to give the microphone to my husband, Tom Brady, who sometimes reaches for it. It's on. Speak into the microphone.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I have a question that's based on my concern about the international and global network of populist parties. And as you know better than I do, that Alexander Dugin and the oligarchs around Putin are very much influenced in supporting populist movements all over Europe and the United States. We do get to Stephen Bannon. They're very good friends and exchange ideas constantly. My sense is that a lot of this comes from two directions. It comes from Russia, primarily, that's trying to destabilize Europe and destabilize the democratic world in general, and has been trying to do so for the last 25 years. And my question about the Czech Republic is, what is your sense of how the populist movement in the Czech Republic is financed? Who pays for it? Because as we now know, Putin and company paid a great deal for Le Pen's election and so on. And the second one is, how close is are the populists in the Czech Republic to the populist movement in Austria, for example, and Germany and so on?
Okay, you're right that many populists.
So if I could repeat the question real quick, the question is, who's financing your populist movement, and how close are they to the other populist movements in Europe?
You're right that many populist leaders in European countries have shown vocal sympathies towards Putin and this regime, like Marine Le Pen in France, like the Austrian foreign minister in the previous government, like many Italian politicians. Hungary and Cyprus always considered kind of joint forces of the Kremlin in the European Union. For example, the extremist party, Party of Direct Democracy I mentioned, led by this Japanese guy, there was evidence that they received some money from Russia before the war. And how they are somehow connected. They try to build, on the European level, they try to build this populist wing. We also have the elections to the European Parliament every 5 years. So they try to connect and cooperate as much as possible before the upcoming election, which is going to be next May 2024, to get as much support as possible and to have a stronger voice on the European level. But I don't think it will happen, at least in the Czech Republic, because they only have minor support between 7, maybe 9%, hopefully. Let me get back to Russia. Believe me, I have a lot of experience with the Russians, with the selfishness, arrogance, the false idea of their supremacy and the uniqueness. But we cannot really blame ordinary Russians for what is happening. Imagine you're living in a country where there is no independent press. You're living in a bubble. You're allowed to receive only one source of information, the official propaganda channels approved by Kremlin. So it is very complex. As a historian, I'm focusing primarily on the Cold War. So I did a lot of research about the communist propaganda in the 1950s. And the Russians are using the very same rhetorics and the very same features for the past 100 years. I don't even understand why anyone believes that crap today. But there are still many people that do that. Václav Havel, he was the first president of democratic Czechoslovakia, but then after the fall of the Iron Curtain in 1989, his first state visit as a president of Czechoslovakia, he went to the United States. He came to Washington, D.C. in January 1990, so only 1 month or 2 months after the revolution. And he gave a speech at the Congress, both chambers, the House and the Senate. And they were asking him, so, Mr. President, what would you need from us? Would you, the new democracy, peoples of Czechoslovakia and peoples in Central and Eastern Europe, what would you need from us, from America, from the leader of the free world? And he said, please help us, or help the Soviet Union on its very complicated path to democracy. And it was a very important idea. He didn't think of ourselves. He didn't think of the Czech Republic, just a tiny country in the heart of Europe. He thought about the Soviet Union, because that was the empire that was falling apart. So he stressed and emphasized the issue of the Soviet path to democracy, which was much more important than all the changes that were happening in Eastern and Central Europe. So I think that early 1990s, it was the first stage of the collapse of the Soviet Empire, or the Russian Empire, the Russian meaning of the world. And now we see the second stage. Because even the satellite countries like Georgia, Armenia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, now they see that this powerful Russian bear is probably not so powerful and not so dangerous as they thought. So now we are trying to break free of the Russian influence. So let's see how it develops. But I think now we are living in exciting times. We'll be reading about them very soon in the history books. Only what happened in terms of Euro-Russian relations in the past 30 years, 30 months of the war, that's incredible. All the sanctions, frozen assets of Russian central bank, like 50% of the Russian money abroad, frozen, confiscated. That's incredible. So I think that it will be very interesting.
Thank you very, very much. Are there any other questions before I make 2 more comments? Okay. Given the negative information you just gave us, the bad news, no. The bad news is that it's going to continue changing, and we don't know how it's going to change. That's why we have to have important speakers here like Martin. But the good news is that his book, and I've read part of it, I'm gonna talk about your book, $15 just for you. It's a very positive view of the Czech immigrants coming to the Northwest. And it's a positive view of how important they became to create the culture and the country we have now. So if you would like a copy, there's just a few remaining up here, please come up and Martin will sign it for you, and you can give him cash or check. And Czech Republic, oh God, it's a fun, sorry, cash or check. And Martin, thank you so much. This has been great. Very good. And thank all of you for coming out tonight. Drop off your yellow and green pages on the